The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer greatly from the elders, the chief priests, the scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. Then Peter took Jesus aside and began to rebuke him. God forbid, Lord, no such thing shall ever happen to you. He turned and said to Peter, Get behind me, Satan. You are an obstacle to me. You are thinking not as God does, but as human beings do. Then Jesus said to his disciples, Whoever wishes to come after me must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. Whoever wishes to save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. What profit would there be for one to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? Or what can one give in exchange for his life? For the Son of Man will come with his angels in his Father's glory, and then he will repay all according to his conduct. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
So we've been going through scriptures this year and getting acquainted with the adventure, right, of God's story with his people. And so we started by talking about the beginning of creation all the way up until the birth of Moses, right? That's the book of Genesis. And then the book of Exodus starts with the birth of Moses, and it goes all the way until the tabernacle was constructed. So that was about a year after the people arrived at Mount Sinai. The third book of the Bible is Leviticus. Right? It's known as the book that most people don't want to read because it's just a bunch of rituals and regulations about the Old Covenant temple. And it's the book for the priests. And then Deuteronomy, the fifth book of the Bible, is Moses' last sermon before the people of Israel go into the Promised Land. So in between Leviticus and Deuteronomy, you have the book of Numbers. And the book of Numbers is all about the people's journey from Mount Sinai to the Promised Land. So we've been speaking about the book of Numbers the last few weeks. We talked a few weeks ago about how when they started their march, right, they made the sign of the cross with their camp and their tribes. And then a couple weeks later, we talked about the reason why the people of Israel were in the desert for 40 years. They were in the desert for 40 years not because it took that long to get to the Promised Land. It only takes about 3 weeks on foot to get from Mount Sinai to Jericho. It took them 40 years because they sent 12 spies into the Promised Land. And the 12 spies did not believe that God would actually give them victory in the land because the people were fierce and large and numerous. Now today I want to basically finish up the book of Numbers, right? So there's a couple of scenes that we're going to skip over. Right? We're skipping over 40 years of events. Right? There was this episode called the Korah Rebellion. The Korah Rebellion was basically, if you ever go to the Sistine Chapel, there's a really interesting depiction of it. But basically, the people were upset that only Aaron and his brothers and his descendants could be priests. And they started rebelling. And famously, as a punishment, the ground opened up and swallowed them alive. Right? So be careful when you question your priest. Okay? It's the Korah Rebellion. And then later on, people, as they normally did when they were wandering through the desert, they started getting impatient with Moses, and so they started grumbling against Moses because they wanted to have water. And this is where there's the famous scene of Moses striking the rock. It actually happened twice during the journey through the wilderness. It happened at the very beginning, shortly after they were liberated from Egypt. Moses struck the rock and brought forth water. And then there was a second time, and that happened many years later. And that was when God punished him. So you might recall, God told Moses he would not be allowed into the promised land because of what he did. How many times people read that and they're like, I don't really understand, why was God so upset? What most people believe is that God actually told Moses to speak to the rock in the book of Numbers. And instead of speaking to the rock, Moses struck it in anger and frustration. And so that's why God punished him for losing his temper and for not doing what God told him to do. So those are a couple of scenes in the book of Numbers. Now, fast forward many years, and I want to talk to you about what happened just before the people entered into the promised land. So they wandered for 40 years, and it was finally time for them to enter. And word spread about this. The people of Israel are very numerous by this point. The people living in the promised land, it's not like they didn't know they were there. They had heard about what God had done in Egypt. And they had heard about some of the battles the Israelites were fighting. And so some of the people living in the promised land, they actually went out to do battle against the Israelites. There was a man named Og, the king of Bashan. Would you like to have the name Og? Right? We should bring that back. Right? Og. Anyway, Og, the king of Bashan, went out to battle against the people of Israel, and was easily defeated. Then there was another king, Sihon, king of the Amorites. He went out to do battle against the Israelites, and again was easily defeated. And so the people of the promised land, they were really nervous. And there was this man named Balak. Balak was the king of Edom. And he tried to be more intelligent than the other kings. He said, obviously we're not going to be able to beat them in battle, but maybe we can beat them spiritually. And so Balak, he hired this man named Balaam. How many of you have heard of Balaam before? All right, some of you, okay? Balaam is kind of an interesting person because Balaam was a seer. He was a soothsayer. He was a prophet. I hope that everybody here is aware that as Catholics, we actually do believe in prophets and seers and psychics. The problem, though, is that if they are legitimate, it's because their power is coming through a demonic influence. As Catholics, we recognize that the devil and his demons, they do have certain powers. They're much more intelligent than us and much stronger than us. And so never go to a psychic, never go to a card or anything like that. Because if they're not a complete fraud, it's because there's some demonic influence working through them. So Balaam was one of these people. Balaam was not an Israelite. He was a Gentile. And he was very well known in the ancient world. As a matter of fact, we've actually found documents that speak about Balaam outside of the Bible. That's how well known he was. That there, in archaeological discoveries, they found different documents that speak about Balaam. Balaam is kind of significant as well because part of the story, what happened to him is that he went to curse the people of Israel because that's what Balak hired him to do. And God forbade him to curse and only bless the people of Israel. And in the midst of his blessing, he actually uttered a famous prophecy about King David. Balaam, he was standing there prophesying, and he said, I see one far off. A star shall come from Jacob. How many of you have heard of the Star of David? The Star of David, the famous national symbol of the Jews, right? It comes from that prophecy of Balaam. The star. It was a prophecy about a famous king that would come. Right? It was King David. And after King David passed away, many of the Jews, they believed that that star wasn't just about King David, but it was also about the eventual Messiah who would come, right? The Savior of Israel. That's why famously there was a man in Israel living in the 1st century who he changed his name to Bar Kokhba, which which means son of the star in Hebrew. And he pretended to be the Messiah. And unfortunately for him, he was easily defeated by the Romans. But there was this star. When the Magi, remember when the Magi came seeking Jesus, right, in his manger, they said they saw a star in the sky. Why were they looking for a star in the sky? It's because Balaam prophecy was not just known in Israel, it was known by many people throughout the world. And the Magi, presumably, would have studied some of the magical arts of the ancient world. So they would have been familiar with famous prophets like Balaam. So that's where we get the Star of David, and that's why the Magi were looking for the star. So anyway, very interesting story about Balaam. But maybe the part of Balaam's life that, if any of you are familiar with the life of Balaam, you probably know this part of the story, is that when Balaam was hired by Balak to go out and curse the people of Israel, he was riding his donkey, right, on the way there. And God sent an angel of the Lord to kill Balaam on the way, to prevent him from cursing Israel. And Balaam couldn't see the angel, but his donkey could. And so his donkey 3 times basically like suddenly swerved out of the way of the angel. And Balaam beat his donkey. And after that happened 3 times, finally God actually opened the mouth of the donkey, and the donkey rebuked Balaam. He said, "Why have you struck me 3 times? All my life I have been faithful to you as your donkey. I've never done this before. Did you not see that there's an angel of the Lord waiting to slay you on the way?" And at that moment, God opened Balaam's eyes and he could see the angel of the Lord. And the angel bowed for the donkey and said, "I was going to kill you if your donkey had not swerved out of the way." Now again, we might hear this story and think, that's just a bunch of fairy tale stuff. Right? Don't forget, Balaam was very well known in the ancient world. And also don't forget that if God and demons, right, if they could use psychics, soothsayers and stuff like that, why could God not use a donkey? It wasn't that the donkey himself was speaking, it was that God was speaking through the donkey. Now, the reason why I bring up this story is because I just think it's very interesting. And I also think it's very relevant for that all of us should be aware of this story. One of the beautiful things when you read the Bible is you start to learn about the kind of people that God chooses to bring about his will and his mission. Oftentimes it's people that you wouldn't expect. Like Moses, for example. Moses, before he went off into the desert for 40 years, he had to flee Egypt because he had murdered an Egyptian. Later on, when God appeared to Moses in the burning bush, Moses revealed that he had a speech impediment. He wasn't a good speaker. And yet God chose that murderer with a speech impediment to go and stand up to the most powerful man in the world, Pharaoh of Egypt. King David, the greatest of all the kings of Israel, he was an adulterer. And not only an adulterer, he was a murderer. He murdered the man whose wife he had an affair with. God chose him to be the king of Israel. God doesn't always choose the people we would expect. And God can even choose an ass to bring about his will. A donkey. One of my favorite stories is it's about St. John Vianney. He's the patron saint of all parish priests. And St. John Vianney, sometimes he kind of struggled with some of his parishioners. His parishioners thought he was a little too strict and rigid, that his homilies were too much fire and brimstone. And so one day, one of his parishioners, they called him the other word for donkey. Right? And he famously replied, he said, "Well, if Samson could kill 2,000 Philistines with just the jawbone of an ass, imagine what he could do with the whole thing." That was his response. And I've always loved that story. In order to do God's will, we don't have to be perfect. We don't have to be a saint. We don't have to be some amazing theologian. God can use whoever and whatever he wants to be his instrument. The question is, do we allow ourselves to let God use us as instruments? But when I was in seminary, I had the experience. Some of you know, I was able to go to Rome for a semester. And my dad was able to visit me while I was there. He was there for about a week, and by the time he left, I think we were both about ready to rip each other's heads off. Used to living together over there in a foreign place, and when I came back, I was really surprised. I'd go into town with him, like at the grocery store and things like that, and people started calling him the preacher man. I was kind of perplexed. Right? My dad is not a preacher. He's not a theologian or anything like that. But what had happened is that when he came back from Rome, he was telling everybody about the experience and about how amazed he was with the things that he saw and how impactful it was on his life and how everybody should go see the tombs of the saints and see the church. I even went with him into a liquor store, and they were calling him preacher man. I thought, man, how beautiful is that? That was my dad being an instrument. Some of you know we have a parishioner here. His name is Jacob Rojas. He's a Hispanic. He's bilingual. He's always hanging around St. Bernard. And one of the other things I love about Jacob is that when I go with him in public places like the restaurants and stuff like that, everybody knows Jacob's name. Like, I'm used to being the priest. Like, everybody can tell who I am, right? So people are saying hi to me and stuff. More people know who Jacob is than know who I am. And it's because he's always trying to find ways to serve people in the community. Just yesterday afternoon, he brought one of our homebound parishioners with him to Mass. He's always thinking of an instrument. Do you allow God to use you as an instrument? Are you paying attention? You don't have to know all the answers. You just have to let God use you. Sometimes we have no idea the kind of impact we can make on somebody just by paying attention. The two examples I just gave were about adults, but I want to speak to the people here who are younger, people who are still in school, high school, middle school, elementary school. I had a very dear friend when I was at my last parish, and she told me how when she was in high school, this time she's a very devout Catholic now, but when she was in high school, she really struggled with depression and anxiety. She actually considered suicide a lot during her youth. And she said what changed for her was she had a couple of friends who invited her to the church youth group. And one of the things she learned by going to that youth group is she learned that God is real. And that even if she tried to take her own life, her life is still not hers. That wouldn't be the end of the story. That'd be the beginning of eternity, not the end. And she credits that to being the reason why she's still alive. And I doubt that those high schoolers who invited her to a youth group were perfect or amazing theologians. But they allowed themselves to be instruments. They invited her. Just like that beautiful baby, an instrument, everybody's entertainment right during this mama. All of us can be instruments. And I remember another story, for my life, when I was a freshman in high school, I wasn't involved at my church or my youth group or anything like that. And, I had a classmate who I probably had maybe one conversation with my whole life. And he made a point to come up to me out of the blue, and he told me that he was forming a small group with one of the adults from his parish, our Protestant church. And he asked me if I'd join a small group. And I was pretty hesitant. I had no idea what that meant. That's not really something we do as often as Catholics. But I joined. And it was amazingly influential on me. That was really the beginning of my faith journey. Because one of my classmates who hardly even knew me was courageous enough to invite me. I think the young people in our church, more than anybody else, it's more important that you understand that you need to be an instrument. I found a statistic last week that said now that the second leading cause of death amongst teenagers is suicide. People in our modern age are desperately struggling. They don't know what the meaning of life is. They don't know if God is actually real. Social media and technology has isolated so many of us. We don't have sufficient personal interactions anymore. It's all on a screen. We all need to be instruments, especially you. We'll never know the kind of impact that we can make if only we are open to being God's instruments. Extending an invitation. Checking up on somebody to see how their operation went or anything like that. Personal struggles. God can even use a donkey. He can use you. Will we let him use us?